You've probably watched some documentary and thought it, why doesn't someone just go get it? We've landed rovers on Mars, mapped the entire ocean floor from satellites, and yet a 46,000-ton ship sits less than 400 miles off the coast of Canada, completely untouched, for over a century. Picture the actual weight of that water above it, pressing down on every square inch, in total darkness, at a temperature just above freezing, in a silence nothing living was ever meant to sit inside for this long. That's not a lack of funding or a lack of will. It's something stranger, and stranger still once you notice how much it resembles a feeling you probably already know, the urge to reach back and fix something time has already gotten its hands on. By the end of this, you'll know about the pressure that can crush a submarine in milliseconds, the microscopic organism that's quietly been eating the ship since before scientists even had a name for it, and the surprising legal reason nobody's even allowed to try bringing it back to the surface, no matter how much money or technology they have. The first attempt happened almost immediately, while the disaster was still front-page news. Within months of the sinking in April 1912, grieving families, the Guggenheims, the Astors, the Whittiners, people who had just lost fathers and husbands on that ship pooled their fortunes and hired a salvage company to go raise it, hoping to recover both the ship and the bodies still believed to be inside it. Divers were sent down almost immediately after the salvage company was hired. They didn't get remotely close. The technology of 1912 topped out at a few hundred feet of usable diving depth, and Titanic's at over 2 miles beneath the surface. In a part of the ocean nobody had any real way to reach yet. At one point, the salvage company even considered dropping dynamite directly onto the wreck to jar loose the bodies still inside so they'd float to the surface on their own, until oceanographers warned them the pressure down there would likely compress a human body into something unrecognizable. That detail turned out to be scientifically wrong, but it didn't matter, the whole plan was already dead. For the next 73 years, nobody even knew exactly where the wreck was. It took until 1985, when oceanographer Robert Ballard finally located it, working alongside French oceanographer Jean-Louis Michel. And here's what's fascinating. Ballard wasn't actually looking for the Titanic, not officially. He was a Navy commander running a classified mission to photograph 2 sunken nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and USS Scorpion, using a new imaging technology the military wanted tested under real conditions, and only got permission to search for Titanic with whatever days were left over once that real assignment was finished. He had 12. So why can't today's technology just finish what those 1912 divers started? Because the environment down there is almost unimaginably hostile, closer to the surface of another planet than anywhere most humans will ever stand. The wreck sits at roughly 12,500 feet, split into 2 main pieces about 2,000 feet apart, under pressure of about 400 atmospheres, close to 6,000 pounds pressing on every single square inch, in water hovering just a couple of degrees above freezing, in darkness so complete that submersible lights only penetrate a few dozen feet before the black simply swallows them. Translate that pressure figure into something you can actually picture. It's the equivalent of balancing a small car on top of your thumbnail. If that still sounds abstract, here's what it means in practice. In June 2023, a submersible called Titan, built specifically to carry paying passengers down to this exact wreck, suffered what investigators called a catastrophic implosion, caused by a hull design that engineers had warned about years earlier. Among the 5 people on board was Paul Henry Nargeolet, a French submarine pilot who had made more dives to the Titanic than almost anyone alive, someone who understood this environment better than nearly any human being who has ever lived. It happened in milliseconds. None of them had time to register what was happening. That's not a design flaw unique to one company. That's simply what this depth does to anything imperfect. Reaching the surface again with something the size of an ocean liner isn't an engineering problem you solve with a bigger crane and a longer cable. And even if you could survive the trip down and somehow attach cables to the hull, here's the part nobody talks about. There might not be enough hull left to lift. In 2010, 2 Canadian researchers, Henrietta Mann and Bavleen Kaur, working with a team in Spain, identified a previously unknown species of bacteria living on the wreck's rust formations. The samples had actually been scooped off the hull back in 1991 by a robotic arm and sat frozen and unexamined in storage for nearly 20 years before anyone thought to look closely at them. They named the organism Halomonas titanici. This bacterium doesn't just sit on iron the way ordinary rust does. It eats it, pulling electrons directly out of the metal for energy and converting solid steel into the reddish-brown, icicle-shaped formations divers call rusticles, some hanging several feet long off what used to be the ship's railings and davits. Mann herself has estimated that this process could bring about the collapse of major sections of the wreck within a matter of decades. The Titanic isn't simply rusting the way a car rusts in a driveway. It's being digested, one microscopic bite at a time, by an organism nobody could even put a name to until 2010. Before this goes any further, if you're enjoying the rabbit hole, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what's coming next is the part most documentaries skip entirely. The legal fight over who's even allowed to touch this ship, and exactly why the people who know this wreck better than anyone alive have never once tried to move it. None of that has stopped people from going back, again and again, in growing numbers as the technology allowing it slowly improved. Filmmaker James Cameron alone has made 33 separate dives to the site since the 1990s, partly for research and partly, by his own account, because he simply couldn't stay away once he'd seen it firsthand. On one of those trips, in September 2001, his crew surfaced from days at the bottom of the Atlantic to discover the entire world above them had changed while they were gone. Nobody on board had any idea the September 11th attacks had even happened until they climbed back on deck. That's how separate that world down there really is. Here's what's fascinating. The more expeditions like his have documented the wreck in detail, mapping every collapsing wall and every pair of leather shoes still sitting undisturbed in the debris field, the less anyone with actual expertise argues for moving it at all. Familiarity didn't make the ship feel more retrievable. It made the case for leaving it alone stronger. So what's actually stopping us? The answer is simpler than you'd think. By the time humans finally had the technology to reach the Titanic had already stopped being something you could lift. The steel that made it a ship is no longer reliably steel, not in the load-bearing, hold-together under stress sense that lifting an object out of the ocean actually requires. Engineers who've studied the wreck closely have pointed out that even a gentle attempt to attach cables to sections of the hull risks tearing them apart on the spot. The metal now closer in strength to wet cardboard than the plating that once carried thousands of passengers across the Atlantic. And here's the last piece. Even setting the physics aside entirely, we're not legally allowed to try. In 1994, a U.S. federal court granted a company called RMS Titanic Inc. exclusive salvage rights, but with a very specific limit written into the ruling. They're permitted to remove loose artifacts from the surrounding debris field, roughly 6,000. Of them so far, everything from dinnerware to a 20-ton piece of the hull that had already fallen away on its own and became known among the crew as the big piece, but they cannot legally touch what remains of the main structure itself. That single legal distinction has held for 3 decades now, through multiple ownership changes and a company bankruptcy, without a single court ever loosening it. In 2019, the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Canada formally activated an international agreement protecting the wreck site as a maritime memorial, specifically to stop any future attempt to disturb it, no matter who eventually built a submersible strong enough to try. More than 1,500 people died there, and official guidelines explicitly instruct salvors to avoid disturbing anything that might still contain human remains. Robert Ballard, the man who found it, deliberately left it untouched the moment he located it, and has spent decades since arguing it should be treated the way we treat a war grave, not a construction project waiting for the right crane. So here's what actually happened, in order. Grieving families tried and failed within months, defeated by a depth their technology couldn't even approach. The wreck then vanished from human knowledge entirely for 73 years, sitting in the dark while the world above it fought 2 world wars and invented the airplane, the television, and the personal computer. A Navy cover story aimed at 2 lost submarines stumbled onto it almost as an afterthought, with 12 spare days at the end of a classified mission. The pressure down there turned out to be able to crush a modern, purpose-built submersible before its passengers could even register what was happening, a fact. One of the most experienced people to ever dive there learned the hard way. A bacterium nobody had bothered to name until 2010 turned out to have been quietly dissolving the hull the entire time, 1 electron at a time, since long before that. And in the end, the law, backed by 4 governments and the man who found the wreck in the first place, decided the site deserved to be left exactly where it was, regardless of who might eventually build a submersible strong enough to try. You've probably wanted to go back and fix something that time had already changed too much to reverse, an old photo too faded to restore properly, a relationship too far gone to patch back together, a version of yourself from a few years ago you can't quite get back to no matter how hard you try, the instinct to raise it, whatever. It happens to be in your own life, feels like the responsible thing to do, the caring thing, the thing a person who hadn't given up would attempt, but sometimes the most respectful response isn't recovery. It's letting something stay exactly where the years left it, sealed in its own cold and its own dark, and choosing to remember it clearly instead of insisting on dragging it back to a surface it was never going to survive reaching anyway. Some things are meant to be visited carefully, from a respectful distance, not raised. If a story like this equal parts science, tragedy, and a slightly uncomfortable reminder about what we can't undo is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because there's another one of these waking up in the drafts right now. And if you've ever had your own Titanic, something you wanted to raise back up but knew, deep down, you shouldn't, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments.